As Spencer saw it, the healthiest humans lived and reproduced while nature's failures, quote, end quote, those with mental physician or moral deficiencies did not. Life has reached its present height, he said, under a universal law of nature, that a creature not energetic enough to maintain itself must die. Yeah, okay. Spencer believed that this violent sorting was not only natural but right. Intervening to help the unfit would weaken all of humanity, and eventually the degenerate species would fail to hold its ground in the presence of antagonistic species, he wrote. This compassionate course would, he insisted, be fatal to the human race. It was dangerous folly for reformers of the government to rescue the poor and weak from the natural forces that were defeating them, he insisted. Quote, if they are not sufficiently complete in life, they die, and it is best they should die. Spencer's pitiless view of the human condition would later be branded social Darwinism. So yeah, by the way, Darwin gets a lot of shit for like spouting a lot of eugenics shit, and maybe he was a little racist, but he didn't really promote it in this dark, bleak way like Spencer did. So, oh, and also his cousin Galton. Yeah, so I'm not saying Charles Darwin was like good, great in the head, all there or whatnot, but yeah, he gets a lot of shit. Anyways, Spencer's pitiless view of the human condition would later be branded social Darwinism, but his writings later preceded Darwin's. It was 8 years after the Social Statics that Charles Darwin, the British evolutionary theorist, introduced his observation of the natural world into discussion. In 1859, in his Origin of the Species, Darwin argued that animal populations evolve over time through a process of natural selection. There was considerable interest in applying these evolutionary theories to mankind. Darwin would do this himself more than a decade later, but a relative of his did it first. Francis Galton, Darwin's half-cousin, turned the newly emerging ideas about evolution into a science of human improvement. In 1869, Galton published Hereditary Genius, an inquiry into laws and consequences, a study of the families of some of the history's most brilliant thinkers and athletes. Galton concluded, as his title gave way, that genius was hereditary. In the same way, various traits were passed on an animal world. Galton, who was intent on being taken seriously as a scientist, boasted that his analysis was the first to treat, quote, the subject in a statistical manner. Galton went on to turn the science of human improvement that he was developing into an intellectual movement. In 1883, he published the Inquiries into Human Faculties and Its Development, the book in which he coined the word eugenics, derived from the word eu from good and genes for born. Eugenics was, Galton explained, a brief word to express the science of improving stock. Galton called on humanity to take its future into its own hands by adopting eugenics programs that would promote the more suitable races, quote, the more suitable races or strains of blood over the less suitable. Though such efforts, he argued, quote, what nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man may do providently, quickly, and kindly. Having invented eugenics and set out its ambitious goals, Galton wrote and lectured on the subject extensively, becoming the journal Nature observed indefatigable in his zeal to promote the cause. For Galton, eugenics was not only a hard and indisputable science, but also an ethical and spiritual movement. Eugenics exalted marriage, in his view, by bringing greater focus on the quality of the offspring a union would generate. He considered eugenics measures to be a form of philanthropy bestowed by the present generations on future ones. Galton was convinced that eugenics would lift humanity to glorious new heights. It was, he declared, quote, a virile creed full of hopefulness. In his writings, Galton described two kinds of eugenics, quote, positive and negative. Positive eugenics, the one which interested him the most, meant encouraging people with superior traits to have more children. In evaluating an individual's worth to the species, he believed there was three main considerations: physique, ability, and character. All were important, and he deemed inferiority in any of all three to outweigh superiority in the other two. At the same time, Galton saw value in negative eugenics, which called for preventing reproduction of those with undesirable traits. Galton was convinced that England was overstocked and overburdened with the listless and the incapable. He believed affirmative action steps would be taken to address this drag on humanity, whether isolating the unfit so they could not reproduce or through some other less drastic yet adequate measure. Galton was vague about the specifics, obviously, but he insisted that, quote, our democracy would ultimately refuse consent to that liberty of propagating children which is now allowed to the undesirable classes. While his half-cousin was building a movement, Darwin was doing his own work on humans and evolution, though of a more evaluated scientific sort. In 1871, he published a second work of evolutionary theory, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, in which he applied many of the ideas he had laid out on origin of the species to humanity. The book was wide-ranging in its subject matter, including extensive discussions of evolution of specific physical and mental traits in humans and nature of racial distinctions and division of labor between men and women. Well, maybe I'm wrong about Darwin. To my knowledge, anyways, I guess. Darwin touched on some of the issues Galton and the eugenicists were speaking to, including the popular debate over whether society should help its weakest members. Many eugenicists believe philanthropy was a threat to the human race, as the philosopher and reformer Jane Hume Clapperton complained. Charities, quote, deliberately selected the half-starved, the diseased, the criminals, and enabled them to exist and propagate. Many eugenicists and Tory politicians also opposed the widespread use of vaccinations, another invention that, as they saw it, helped people survive who had been targeted by nature for illness and death. So yeah, eugenicists were against vaccinations, which kind of says to me that people who are against vaccinations are even though it is sketchy corporations utilizing them, it really isn't like vaccines, and I feel like it's eugenicist propaganda to be like, don't take them, you know. So, aside from anything that could happen just in your own anecdotal world, but yeah, it's good to keep in mind, I guess.